Hi, welcome to another installment of What is Metamodern Conversations. I am your co-host, Greg Dember.
And I'm Linda Sariello. Thanks for joining us today. We have today Tope Folarin. Tope, thank you so much for being with us today.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
I'll just do a short biography. Tope is a Nigerian-American writer based in Washington, D.C. He serves as the director of the Institute for Policy Studies, which is a think tank in D.C., and is also a visiting lecturer in creative writing at Georgetown University. He's the recipient of several awards in writing, including the Kane Prize for African Writing, the Whiting Award for Fiction, and a fellowship from the National Endowment for Arts, to just name a few. And to let audiences know how we know about you is that Greg struck up a conversation with you, or vice versa. I don't know who contacted who, a few years back, based on both of your interests in metamodernism. And Greg featured your novel, A Particular Kind of Black Man, which we'll be talking about today quite a bit, hopefully. He featured this in his recent book. So this is Greg's recent publication, which is a survey of metamodernism and culture called Say Hello to Metamodernism, Understanding Today's Culture of Ironicity, Felt Experience, and Empathic Reflexivity. And so that prompted me to also read your novel as well. And so again, we're delighted to have you here to talk about all things writing, metamodernism, creating. And in our time together, we also hope to ask you about your current works. And in particular, I think it would be nice to share with viewers how you came to learn about metamodernism, how it's
Yeah.
informed your works, and whether it's something you're continuing to lean into as you write and create. So maybe to get us started, would you like to speak a little bit about how you first encountered the notion of metamodernism?
Yeah, it's a good question. First of all, thank you both again for having me on. I'm so honored to be on this podcast and having this conversation. Um, it's hard to say. I think it was probably back in 2010-ish. I was just like rooting around on the internet looking for, I had this sense that there was a couple things that when there was maybe a shift happening in terms of in a lot of the art that I was reading and watching and the music I was listening to, it felt like there was a shift happening, and I was trying to get my head around what was happening. Um, that was part of it, and then I was also writing and feeling that, especially in the realm of literature, a lot of the work that I was reading didn't seem to be capturing reality as I felt it. And so I just had this sense that are what are thinkers, what are they talking about here? And in college and even grad school, I did a fair bit of reading about modernism and postmodernism, and I love visual art, and I loved, like, the artists who were working at the dawn of the 20th century, those artists who were really sort of grappling with the rise of photography and how that represented like sort of competition to what they were doing and the way they innovated in that space. And so I had some, I guess, working knowledge, though I was approaching it much more, I believe, as an artist, perhaps more than as a theorist. But I guess as a result of these sort of concerns and ideas and perspectives, I just started looking around on the internet. I could have also been influenced. There was a book that came out in 2010 called Reality Hunger by David Shields that was really important to me. Um, I felt that, because I was reading a lot of literature that did emphasize like lived experience. And looking back, it's apparent that I was moving in this direction because I was beginning, perhaps on a subconscious level, to think about what it would mean to write a novel. And so I was like, sort of, even if I wasn't admitting it to myself, I was beginning that sort of thought process. And um, I think that Shields in that book talks a lot about his dissatisfaction with like fiction, the tropes of fiction, how contrived and artificial a lot of literary fiction feels, and I felt the same way. And this kind of turn towards, you know, this turn towards rendering your reality as opposed to trying to come up with something fake to express very real emotions. So I think it's that sort of combination that motivated me, that reading Shields, thinking about my work, engaging with art, that prompted me to start doing some research.
And what did you happen onto first? I think I know, but go ahead.
Yeah, I think it was the paper that came out in 2010, right? The sort of
The
Notes on.
Vermeulen and Van Denneker
yes, yeah.
paper.
2010 was
Yeah.
like a really important year. So I read, Shield's book, I read the essay. Um, there was interesting stuff happening in the movies as well, that I was really intrigued, like Abbas Kiarostami released a film called Certified Copy that was just, it's one of my favorite films. And I think I hesitate to call things metamodern because, but, it certainly opened up a range of ideas for me. And there was a lot of art that I was consuming that year and ideas that I was reckoning with. So I think I read that paper. And upon reading it, I said, "Oh, that's really fascinating." The kind of talk of oscillations was something that felt really accurate and true to me because, I am, I think some people in my life would say that I am in certain ways painfully sincere. I don't, not in a pejorative way, but just super sincere. Uh, and that's something that's important to me. And I never felt quite comfortable with I was very aware when I was in school, especially college and post grad, that a marker of intelligence was having this ironic posture, like kind of dismissing everything. And I never felt comfortable with that.
You're in
And
good
I struggled
company.
with that mightily when I'm sorry, what did you say?
You're in good company.
Okay.
Yes.
I struggled mightily with that in college and grad school because I thought like, well, is it possible to be like intelligent, be a thinker, and also be you know, also like just like sincere and vulnerable and that sort of thing. Because I didn't see many spaces for that kind of orientation, I guess you could say. Um, and so I think the fact that around this 2010, 2011, 2012 period, it seemed like there were a lot of artists who were grappling with those same set of questions and were producing art that addressed those questions was really meaningful for me. And reading that paper was really meaningful for me. And reading and Greg and I have talked about this. There was like a boomlet of sort of ideas around that after that paper, like and I guess a number of people grappling with what metamodernism is or was, and people defining it differently according to their own sort of ideas about, what's happening in the world or what they wanted to see in the world. And there was this moment of, I guess, theoretical dissension, perhaps is one way of putting it, where folks are like, what's actually going on here? And then let's defining. And so I think both of you have done really essential work in pinning it down in a way and saying, well, this is what it means. And here's what we mean when we talk about metamodernism. And here's the art that we're referencing when we talk about this turn that's happened, sort of in the opening years of the 21st century.
Thank you. That's nice of you to say that. Well, I hope
Um,
we've done something to help sort of create a kind of a container for looking
Yeah.
at, looking at it from different angles and examining what the cultural products are doing in culture that make them somehow coherent or make them seem like they represent or they are co-creating a shift that's happening.
I think it's really important because, and I'm, I think a lot of times artists just they are responding to the moment. Like something feels weird. Let me write about this, or let me make a song about it, or let me make a film or something. And more often than not, they're not sort of reading, papers and saying, okay, well, oh, that's good. Let me create a piece of art that's in response to it. And that's why I think the work that both of you have done is so important because over the course, you look at a lot of these cultural products and you say, wow, they share certain connections. What's actually happening? And I think doing that work is really important because it's something that as a consumer, if you will, of media, I certainly sense, but don't necessarily have the time, to kind of sit down and try to draw to make those connections. Um and I think that's the other reason why reading that early work about metamodernism was important to me because I thought, oh, here's somebody who's like, or here are a couple people at least who are grappling with some of these ideas and they're putting forward a notion that seems to me to make a great deal of sense. And then of course, after this postmodern, some people would still say that we're in a postmodern moment, but I certainly don't think so. there's always the question of what happens next, and what is the kind of cultural theory that accounts for this fractured moment we're in, the death of like the sort of monoculture, like all this stuff that's happening that that is sometimes hard to reckon with, and I think metamodernism does in really important ways.
Um, Before I forget, going back a little bit, it was interesting that you brought in the David Shields and his book Reality Hunger, because when I read it, it I'm going to come out agreeing with you, but it's going to sound like I'm challenging you at first. Um, when I read it, I almost saw it as a sort of late endorsement of a postmodern mindset, uh,
Yeah,
because he's questioning divisions between fact and fiction, and he's doing the thing of challenging the authenticity of the author and kind of all of these sorts of things, and and it's kind of it's belated from the point of view of the postmodern theorists, but it's not belated in terms of kind of the moment that he was actually in, where all of that stuff had kind of come to a crest. So, on the one hand, I startle for a moment when you bring it into a discussion of metamodernism, but then I think further, and it's almost like the concerns that David Shields addresses and the approach that he promotes are like the postmodern starting point upon which somebody might then organically and naturally bring in the sincerity that you were saying you missed. Um,
yeah,
and so it's like the David Shields world plus this extra ingredient of the yearning for sincerity sort of feed together to make the metamodern world, the metamodern mindset. If does that make sense?
that makes complete sense. And I thank you for that intervention because I think it's important. You know, with respect to Shields, what I and I think we all approach work, with our own sort of biases and desires and requirements. And when I read that book, I think I was looking for one uh somebody to help explain what was seemed to be a definite turn towards the elevation of reality and culture, whether that's reality TV or autofiction, which is kind of just starting around that time, and a range of other things as well. And I think his kind of talking about it and recognition of it provided an opening for a bunch of artists to say, oh, that's interesting. Well, if this is a cultural moment when I can surface my own kind of lived experience and not have to rely on, thinking about my work purely through the lens of genre or according to a set of ideas about what's a successful novel in the case of writers and what isn't. That is an important first step. Now, one could look at the series of the kind of early autofictional novels, and I'm talking about this, there's a lot of conversation in the literary world about when autofiction actually began. Some would posit it starts, like at the beginning of fiction. So what are we talking about, autofiction? But I'm talking about the sort of 21st century variant of it. Um, a lot of those works, and I hate to generalize, but I will anyway, a lot of those works are kind of cold and, sort of some sterile. I'm thinking, for example, of Rachel Cusk's work, which is, very, very cold. In my view, some people might disagree. Some of it is, and others. I mean, there's all I'm trying to say is that I think that it could be that the early autofictional works are sort of have postmodern sensibilities, but the fact that there's a book and there's thinking about, you know, um, elevating what's happening inside and making that sort of basis of your work opens the door for people who are, sort of more sincere or whatever else, or searching for something else to say, okay, well, I can now write the thing that I want to write that maybe doesn't sort of align with whatever it is that I was taught that I'm supposed to do when I'm writing fiction. And so I think at the very least, it provides an opening that if this is a moment when we can all talk about our lived experience, then that includes people who have a lived experience of wanting more sincerity and also, being ironic in certain ways, people who oscillate, if you will. Like it opens up a pathway for that kind of engagement with yourself and the world. And so for me, that's what the book did. And a lot of the book too is, he talks about how contrived fiction can be, which I wholeheartedly agree with. And before reading the book, I had started, I, I remember I was reading like, another multi-generational novel or something, and I'm like, I'm sick of this frame. Like, sort of, no disrespect to people who love the frame because, it still sells, and I'm not, obviously it's an important kind of way of, I guess, thinking about human beings. But I just, because I saw the beats, as yeah, I knew what the beats were before I read them. And so I think I was growing exhausted with that kind of literature. And that's prestige fiction. Prestige fiction is multi-generational, or it's historical novel. And it's like usually a few periods. It's like, let's talk about World War II or slavery or Civil War. I mean, you see these eras coming up again and again in literature. And again, important periods of our history. And it's important to know what came before so we can reckon with the present tense. I get all of that. But I was also deeply interested in what happens next. And I think it's important for culture, at least some people who work in culture to think about the past, but others have to think about the future. And I've always seen myself in the latter camp. And so I think Shields' work kind of provided me with a permission structure to think about, the future in ways that I hadn't before.
Cool.
I was going to say, if I were to have to choose between past, present, and future to characterize your novel from 2019, I
Yeah,
would have said present. And
sure.
the reason is I feel like I didn't read Shields. I just know a little bit about the sense of the text, and I want to try to connect what you were talking about just now with some specifics that I have really enjoyed exploring through your book, which is that there are, of course, there's a multiplicity of themes: identity and immigration and Blackness and racism and masculinity, mental illness, families of origin, and through playing with these themes, a sense that they're not meant to stick as much as be felt to be liminal.
Yeah.
And liminality is, of course, a word that shows up in a lot of postmodern products and literature. But I want to try to get at what made me feel this was a different kind of liminality. And I might be wrong, or maybe it's just my my personal interpretation. But it feels like your narrator pokes around the edges of that in-between state, and then the writer does as well. But perhaps inevitably hunkers into it versus choosing between. Like there's a real fractal quality, and we're not meant to choose one fractal face or another of these identities that Tunde, the main character, is working with, or that the author, the writer, the narrator is working with through the vehicle of narration, which I totally love personally. So it feels like the novel maybe feels metamodern because it slips in between identities and continues to speak up for that rather than asking for a kind of purity or a resolution or this one's the right one, this one's the correct one that will solve the personal problems.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I think I really appreciate that interpretation. And as I was writing the book, I did think a lot about like oscillating, and I thought a lot about I thought a lot about, I guess that's another way of saying, you know, inhabiting a liminal space. I really did, partly because I wanted to complicate, which is a word that's perhaps overused in cultural spaces, but I wanted to complicate um a story that I'd seen a number of times, So for example, when I was growing up, I had to exist between a couple or even more worlds. And I know a lot of people say that, but in my case, um, there's the cultural thing, the kind of I'm growing up in Utah and my parents are Nigerian and I'm living in Mormon country and so like I'm having to navigate two spaces and my siblings as well. There's that aspect of it. But then there's a completely different conception of reality as well. And I didn't really begin to reckon with that. I lived it, but I didn't really begin to reckon with it until I was probably in my 20s. And my parents and my father in particular is incredibly religious. I mean, like in a way that probably doesn't, is not comprehensible to people, which is to say that he is Christian and identifies as Christian, but also uh, it's infused, and I don't think he would say this or admit it, but it's infused, with a different cultural understanding of reality than, say, a Christian who was born and raised in this country. My dad would always he'd tell me stories that, just on their face, people would classify as unreal here, like about like somebody doing something wrong and there's a curse and that, like the whole thing falls apart for the family going on. Or, he used to tell me a story, and I've written about this elsewhere, about this little creature that he was friendly with when he was younger. And, and it was the kind of story he told me. Like he said when he was younger, he wandered off into like a wooded area and this creature came to him. It was very small. I think he said it was like maybe a foot long or very small, and he was frightened by the creature. And then creature's like, nothing to be frightened of, I'm your friend, and fell into a friendship and told him about, what his life would be like and that sort of thing. So all of which is to say that, and then also there's the kind of uh, sort of indigenous religion that infuses, sort of cultural practices. And this is complicated to talk about because, then Christianity comes, and Christianity is about repudiating all of that and, sort of, and not only repudiating it, but saying that all of that stuff is satanic, which is to say it's inherently evil. And so then you have generations of people who say, no, that stuff that we did is not good, but it's still a part of the way that people think about and see the world. And so I think, growing up and living in a culture, going to school, and everything's quite binary. Either this thing happened or it didn't happen. Either this thing is real or it's not real. And then going home and it's like, oh, well, there's space in between, It's real and it's not real. It happened and it didn't happen. And I spent a lot of time when I was growing up trying to reconcile. Initially I thought, well, my parents are mistaken. Either something, and especially you're going to school, I should put this in the first person. I'm going to school and I want to do well academically, and there's a certain way of analyzing the world. And the way that I am learning is that it's real or it's not real. It happened or didn't happen. And so I'm like, parent, dad, mom, you guys are wrong. But then as I get older, I think, well, maybe they're onto something, right? About a way of perceiving the world. And I wrote the book from that perspective, like a kind of both and or oscillation, or there are multiple things that are possible here. And I really wanted to play that up to the extent that I could.
Yeah, I really felt that too. I want to follow up on that, and then Greg could jump in again. The both and one is very near and dear to me because I use that in my work as well. And it's an interesting one because as both of you I think know, there's a tendency in Tim Vermeulen and Robin von Denneker's works to use both neither and to sort
Yes.
of eschew the both and.
Yeah.
But for me, at least from the religious studies point of view, the both and is doing a different kind of work, and it's really
Yeah.
important. I think it does actually work in within thinking about something as metamodern, because again, there's this means of like not giving into the tendency, as you already mentioned, of reconciling everything into a neat package, but preserving the fact of that oscillation refers to a sense of there being a lot of realities out there, but none of them necessarily hold the whole truth.
Precisely.
So both but neither being the winner works kind of both neither. But in religious studies, the both and has the meaning is really about how very normal people and very sane people constantly report these experiences that are non-ordinary. They're supernatural, mystical, spiritual experiences. And then they
Absolutely.
have to try to reconcile these non-ordinary realities with ordinary consensus reality in which these things are not supposed to occur or supposed to be considered real, but they are real to the person who had them.
Yes.
So that both and says there's a way to not have to split reality into real versus unreal, true versus fictive. So that's the work it's playing that I kind of stand up for in my own work on metamodernism and
I'm
spirituality.
glad that you're here with, Greg and I had an exchange about this, and I hesitated in saying both and but that's what I was thinking when I wrote the book, and your framework is really, really helpful for me as well as I process what I was, and I knew that a lot of stuff that I wrote maybe wouldn't be legible to certain people. There's, for example, stuff that's important to me in the book that hardly anyone talks about. There's a scene where Tunda is talking with his grandmother, and it's a kind of liminal scene. It's like they're talking because before the conversations are, like he's talking with her and it's in the past, but there's a certain conversation where she's advising him as if she's actually there, as if, they're having a conversation at a critical moment in his life. And she's like, well, why don't you lean into this? Like, lean into this, not understanding what's real. Like, maybe it's not a bad thing, right? And that was, where I was explicitly kind of trying to talk about the way that I've come to think about life and even experience life, which I think is at least for someone like me who grew up in the circumstances that I did, a much healthier way. Because I think the pathway of either or, to reference another book that I know you've but the either or for me does not work. And I tried it for a long time. And I know either or is not about that. It's like but I mean, just a kind of framework. I struggled with that for such a long time, and I thought I have to do one or the other, and it was leading me down a very dark path. And it wasn't until I said, "Let me embrace it all," that things began to open up for me. So and the book is a reflection of that.
Well, I have a whole pile of thoughts and questions. First, just for the benefit of our viewers who may not be familiar with the term and the concept autofiction, maybe we can just kind of settle on a tentative definition of it. And
Yeah.
the way I understand it is, I guess, like in its most classic, pure form, an autofiction is a novel in which the main character has the same name as the author, and some elements of the plot and details of the main character's life are the same as the author's. So, like a biography or like an autobiography, but it very freely deviates from the true reality. And then a more relaxed definition of autofiction, which would apply to your book, is where the main character might not have the exact same name as the author, but it's close enough to hint at it. So, your character is Tunde, which sounds like Tope.
Yeah.
Then there are enough elements in common between their lives that make it clear that you're playing with all of that, even if it's not identical. And so it's playing with autobiography or memoir, and disrupting the norms of that, but it's also playing with and disrupting the norms of the classic novel in which the author is this very outside, objective, uninvolved force to the novel. And in an autofiction, the author's right in there, but not exactly.
Yes.
And I think that your novel definitely fits into all of that. And so what occurred to me when you were both talking about past, present, and future is that I think one thing that's really neat about your novel is that it it shifts throughout the book. Like each section of the book is fighting to claim itself as the point of reference.
Yeah.
So it starts out very much as this sort of linear tale, starting with the main character's birth and with his paternal background, and just kind of leading through, like, and then this year this happened, and then this year this happened, But then all of a sudden there comes another point when all of that is couched as a manuscript that a college student is writing. And so then at that moment, the present of the college student is privileged over everything that's come before.
Yeah.
Um, and that college student who's doing that privileging would have you think that that's kind of the be all end all culmination of the story, but then things move on beyond that point.
Yeah.
Um, and that makes it very fun, I guess,
Yeah.
to read. Um, and as far as the both and or the both neither between a kind of concrete materialist way of experiencing reality versus a more magical way,
Yeah.
um, I love how, like, right at the beginning of the book, there are a few scenes where it seems very much of a sort of magical realism thing, where the older Mormon lady,
Yeah.
uh, sort of manifests out of
Hmm.
thin air, and the way it's told, it feels unworldly.
Yeah. I'm glad you
Um,
clocked that. Yeah.
but then kind of as things go along, the reader, go, I can actually make sense of it. That like it wasn't magical. It was just an actual older white Mormon lady who took the kid by surprise.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
and then these things that sound so weird about, I'll bring you to heaven and all that actually are the mythology
Yeah.
of Mormonism. So now it's about a kind of racism that the character has encountered.
Yeah.
Uh,
Exactly.
okay.
Absolutely. No, I mean, you've identified. I'm so glad we're having this conversation, and it's part of the reason why I think metamodernism is such an important framework because, and I may have said this to you before, Greg. I mean, like a lot of the conversations I had when the book came out, were about like it's a coming of age story, it's an immigration story, and there was a lot of stuff that I was thinking about that I wasn't able to discuss because of the predominant or the sort of frames that exist that people think about, through which people think about fiction, especially fiction, I think, from Black and brown people. So I'm really glad that we're talking about this. And the magical realism stuff was intentional because I was also trying to play with readerly expectations a little bit, to kind of, as a reader starts, I like the feeling when I'm reading where I don't quite know where I am. I'm like, where am I? It's sort of like you're watching a film and it starts with, I tell my students all the time, like if a film starts with a car chase scene or a fight scene, you're like, what's going on? Like, who am I rooting for? Like it's a really interesting moment. And, if done well, it's really effective. If not done well, you spend the rest of the thing being like, what's going on here? I'm like
Right.
really confused. Um, and I wanted to start because there is the question about one, a protagonist who is struggling with what's, reality and what that means for him. Two, he's living in a place where religion's incredibly important. And it's not, in many parts of the country anyway, it's like there is a line between church and state. Not so much the case in Utah. Like
Mm.
everything is integrated. And so what does that mean for the way that people perceive reality, the way they talk about the reality and that sort of thing? And I was thinking of a way to bring the reader directly into it. And also to kind of accept the idea that maybe, she is a kind of angelic figure, but not for him, in a way, right? She is this kind of ethereal figure, but um, it goes to show the kind of the situation he is living in, where even in the hereafter, the kind of, nonsense that exists here in this realm persists. And so I want to show the reader like that's what he's reckoning with. We've been all taught to believe that there's generations of people in this country who endured tremendous suffering and thought of the afterlife as a place where, gosh, finally I'm free. This
Mm.
whole life thing was horrible, but I'm free. And at the beginning of this book, it's like, no, even in the hereafter, you're still doing stuff, and that's not the best. So how do you, if you're raised and you're like 5 or 6 and you're being raised in this environment, how do you break out of that? How do you begin to conceive of a world for yourself where it's possible to achieve freedom both now and in the hereafter? What does that look like? You know?
Yeah, and I want to make a comment too, to just share my sense about how the narrative, the narration, and the sense of reality moves. And I got this the second time I was reading certain sections of it again, and it felt like, I'm gonna see if I can explain this succinctly, but like the early child narrator was trying to find the ground, trying to find firmness. And that was the feeling that the narration has. And then as the narrator gets older, the main character gets older, the actual feeling, the tonal quality of the narration, the themes that come in are more, intricate in terms of the narrator understanding what he doesn't understand, but also the feeling of it. It's as if, I was thinking of it's like a ride when you're on a ride in an amusement park, and at first you're trundling along and like you kind of know like something's coming, but you're still going
It's about to
steady.
happen.
And yeah, so like the
Yeah.
first part of the book, you're going steadily along on the roller coaster, hasn't done anything yet. And then, pretty soon the thing gets more wobbly and takes a big turn. And then, the narrator's getting older, and it feels as if that wobble has entered his life, and the narration is reflected in that. If I'm communicating that properly, it's
Absolutely.
on different
Yeah.
levels it's happening. And so I thought that was just super effective and really interesting to reread a second time, so that I wasn't as focused on the details of the plot.
But yeah. No, I completely understand that. And I think you're right. I mean, for me, part of it is also reckoning with memory. And I think memory is just really interesting. I've always been fascinated by it for all kinds of reasons. And I think something that most people share in common is that your memory, we think about memory, we think about memory a certain way, but we also understand memory. We think about memory as like, oh, it's this transcription of like events, and at some point in the future, you'll be talking with somebody, and you'll say, oh, this thing happened. Remember when this thing happened? But I think we intuitively understand that memory doesn't work that way. That memory is actually a kind of curated, cultivated narrative about the past, right? That, which is to say that it's contrived in certain ways. I think we all intuitively understand that. It's contrived in the same way that literature is kind of contrived. Like there are things that don't fit together, and the memory, or we do, or there's some process by which all of a sudden, a strange random collection of events now adhere to a kind of narrative line, now it has a plot. And I've always been interested in that sort of function of memory, and I wanted to play with that. And I think most people, when they're picking up work to engage with it, expect that very clean narrative line. Like, okay, I'm going to be reading a memoir, and it's going to proceed from this point to that point to that point. But if you're reckoning with memory, you have to also reckon with the fact that memory it's like a frame over events. It's like, okay, here's the story. There's a lot of stuff outside that has been edited out. And I've always been interested in that stuff that's edited out. Like, why are we doing? There's a kind of, I love this book by J.M. Coetzee, and I think the woman's name is Arabella Kurtz, and they're talking about the function of memory, how it's the kind of like personal story that we have. And I think kind of being honest about that is incredibly important. So once you begin to understand it, you can look back and say, okay, why did I construct, or my mind construct, this personal story? And is it still important for me? Is it still serving me now as I move on to this next phase of life? And I knew, and I was my editor, who was a fantastic human, and I was able to have these conversations with him, about it. And And I told him of that. And we talked a lot about he's like, some people will read the book and they just want a plot, right? And so how do you service them? And other people are want to engage with some of these bigger ideas and the fallibility of, and fallibility sounds like pejorative again, like just what memory does, the survival mechanism aspect of it.
Mm.
And so,
Flexibility,
sorry?
flexibility,
Yeah, exactly. It's a
or
much better word.
malleability.
Yeah, malleability is a much better word. Thank you. So if somebody's at a point in their life where they're like, okay, this story that I have about myself no longer serves me. It is a moment of chaos, and I wanted to render that. Like, okay, what's happening? Did it happen this way or that way? But it's chaos that can lead to something that is more beneficial for the person you're becoming, moving forward.
Although also the other side of that is that Tunde has these double memories. At a
Yeah,
certain point in his life, this character is holding both of these realities and really actively, doing what most of us don't do, which is he doesn't put one down and say, I'm eschewing
yeah,
these memories and in favor of these. He's holding them both. And that we're introduced to the idea that there may be, although maybe not, be a component of mental illness. So,
precisely. Yeah,
got on the ground possible, diagnostical realities and these ability to hold more than one thing at once going on, which I also thought that was brilliantly done.
yeah. No, I appreciate that, and I think the mental illness thing is important too because his mom has a mental illness, so he's beginning to think, is that happening to me right now? Can I trust that? But, yeah. Sorry, Greg.
No, it's just um, this is going to be challenging to put into words, but this thing of the double memories and is kind of a breaking of the fourth wall
Yeah.
of the autofiction that I haven't seen in any other autofiction besides yours. So, okay, so if you just have a basic autofiction,
Yeah.
there's the author's life, which is not actually represented in the book. You just
Yeah.
have to research it or somehow know about it. And then there's the story. And sometimes the author's life and the story are the same, and sometimes they diverge. But in this one, you've got that going on, but then the character is actually embodying and experiencing and representing and speaking of that divergence,
Yes.
so to speak.
Hmm.
And it's diegetically explained. It's explained within the built reality of the novel itself.
Yeah.
Um, and there's a film called The Cabin in the Woods that Linda and I co-wrote a chapter in an edited volume, and it's what you would call an elevated horror film. It's horror, but it makes you think.
Yeah.
Have you seen it?
And
I want to watch it and I will track
oh,
it
you'll
down.
love it, I think,
Yeah. Yeah.
if
I
I
can't
dare
wait to
say.
watch it.
Um, and well, and I don't want to give too much away, but one thing that Linda and I argue is unique and makes it metamodern, that film, is that it has intertextuality. It refers to the common tropes of other horror films, but
Sure.
instead of just being sort of stuck in there to remind the viewer that they're watching a film and all that stuff, it actually explains the intertextuality within the mythic
Mm.
diegesis that's present in the film. And when that locks together in the
Yes.
film, it totally transforms kind of what's going on, and it changes it from just being a postmodern film about film to a film that is a film about film, but is also very much about the interior experience of the characters.
Yes.
And it makes the viewer invest in the emotionality
Yes.
of it. And we
Yes.
argue that makes it a metamodern horror film. And that device where everything is actually contained and explained through the diegesis of the work is what is called was named the double frame by an author named Raoul, a theorist named Raoul Eshelman. So, um, by having there be the potential that Tunde is experiencing mental illness, and that's why there's this sort of deviating to realities. To me, that's very similar to what happened in the cabin in the woods, and it's a metamodern double frame, if you will.
Yeah.
And and then I wanted to say that that there autofiction. So Alison Gibbons has written a lot about autofiction as a metamodern mode, but
Huh.
she makes it clear in everything she writes that autofiction, like you said, has been around for a long time and is often classically treated as a very postmodern form. And Allison speaks to this, but in my own words, the difference between the metamodern autofiction and the postmodern autofiction is that the postmodern autofiction is mainly about troubling and challenging the divisions between fiction and nonfiction and making you
Hmm.
think about all of that.
Yeah. Yes.
Whereas the metamodern autofiction is utilizing that device in order to be able to better speak to the emotional reality of the characters and potentially the author and potentially the reader.
Yes.
And I feel
Yes.
that that applies to this novel that you wrote.
I think that's a great, yeah, first of all, that analysis I think is really important for all kinds of reasons. And absolutely, I mean, it's sort of one way of putting it, and you put it so elegantly that I don't mean to reduce it to these terms, but it's like it's just engaging with these ideas, but with a heart at the center of it, right? Like, and that's part of the way I was thinking about it, because yeah, I think sometimes, and I've read a lot of those postmodern works that are interrogating the line between fiction and nonfiction, and they're interesting. But a lot of times they feel like games. They feel like I wanted to do because I have a similar set of questions, and I'm also interested in like probing sort of the line between reality and fiction. But I thought it would be interesting in service of a story, one, and also in service of saying that some people experience reality differently. Some people experience realities. And oftentimes in this culture, speaking as somebody who was born and raised in America, um, there's a sense that if it's getting too weird, okay, you're crazy. Like that's what's
Mm,
going on. Go somewhere. You're out
yeah.
of it.
Yeah, you
Um,
crossed the line.
you've crossed the line, please. And there are certain, spaces where this kind of thinking is acceptable, or this kind of way of being is acceptable. The religious is certainly one. There are a lot of people who go back and forth between like religious experience on Sundays, they're
Right.
speaking in tongues, and and then on Monday they're thinking about legislation. So there is that space. There's another emerging space with the kind of UAP, UFO stuff that I think is really intriguing, and people are passing back and forth between that membrane that's growing thinner. And so it seems like, and then there's like VR that's happening and other
Huh.
things, right? And the
Right.
internet itself represents another space. So what's happening is that our kind of base reality is being, if you will, again, maybe not the best verb here, but invaded by all kinds of other experiences. And I think that seems to be one of the main things that's happening in the century. And there's a lot of art that deals with that, right? There's a lot of art that deals with like the multiverse, or all that sort of stuff. I think it's a kind of cultural recognition of the fact that the idea of a base reality, partly because of what we experience, like like the fragmentation of like the algorithmic fragmentation, we're all in our little bubbles. A lot of people in my generation, I'm an older millennial, are lamenting the fact that when we were younger, we could all turn on MTV at the same time. And there was this big discourse online a few days ago about how, like, even if you grew up like in a rock household, you would watch like MTV, you would be exposed to things that you weren't
Right.
listening to. Say, oh, that's interesting. I like that. And vice versa, if you're growing up in a rap and R&B household, You'd see, like some rock song. You'd think Nirvana. I like what they're doing. That's really cool. Smells like Teen Spirit. That's my kind of song, right? So, and that's no longer the case. Now you have your Spotify playlist and it's feeding you aggressively the same kind of thing. So we're all kind of walking around in our little bubbles. And it's forcing many of us to have a different experience of reality. There's no longer a shared kind of space. There's no longer we're watching the show and then going to talk about it. So there's that kind of literal manifestation of it. And then the kind of more spiritual manifestations of
Yeah.
it as well that I'm deeply interested in.
Yeah, the verbs or the adjectives that you use that I think are really important for us, I think I'd like to really lean on a lot as well, are like porousness
Yeah.
and membranous.
Yeah.
That it's more of a membrane, because what I see that popular culture is reflecting an interest in showing that worlds are not separated by lines. They're
Yeah.
separated by membranes, by really thin ones, and
Yeah.
some cases ones that you can put your hand right through. Stranger Things is coming to mind at that show.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, there's really a lot that is exciting in contemporary religious studies that's trying to make room for and allow for being able to look at religiosity and religious and spiritual experience as something that shows that fluidity in a way that I mean, I think we see more and more people who are recognized figures, famous people who are coming out as having had anomalous experiences. And I think
Yeah.
that's very telling as well, that they can say, yep, on Sunday I had that crazy acid trip, or that experience of speaking in tongues, or
Yeah.
visitation by an alien or whatever. And then I went back to my office job or did my legislative work, and
Yeah.
it needs to all be accounted for, and is increasingly, I think, more so, and especially with narratives like yours that we're looking at that allow for that, the reader to be able to shift between those worlds together with the character. Love it.
Yeah.
And yet it's not, I'm harping on the same point, but it you don't walk away from reading your book just thinking like, oh wow, it's a trippy book about, the multiplicity of reality. It's like, the
That's a beating heart still.
it's like I just finished rereading it like last night, so it's very present for me. And so, your depiction of the arc of Tunde's relationship with I forget her name, but his girlfriend,
Oh, yes.
um,
Uh, Noel.
Noelle.
Yes.
That could just be a very, very moving, devastating short story about heterosexual romantic, or just about
Yeah.
romantic like
Yeah.
it's just very in the ground, very on earth, you know,
Yeah.
as an emotional rendering. Um,
Or it's a figment, like Noel early in the book.
but that's what I'm saying is
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
it serves this sort of overall multiplicity thing by it could be a figment,
Yeah.
but when you but it's not sketching the figment
Yeah.
starkly. It's like when you're telling it, it's fully fleshed out and emotionally fleshed out, and
That
Yeah.
was my ambition, and it's good to hear that. And it's something, again, because I think the book kind of hopefully meets you where you are. If you want to read it straight ahead and he's like falling in love with Noelle, then that's what happens. But there are clues that something else might be happening. I'm not sure if we
Hmm.
talked about this before, Greg, but like Noelle, he's obsessed with Lauryn Hill, the singer, and Lauryn Hill's middle name is Noelle. He
Huh.
introduces her by saying, "Now the joy of my world is a Noelle." Now the joy of my world is a lyric from a song called To Zion, which was a really big song. Now the joy of my world is in Zion. So there are clues. She has dreadlocks. He describes her when I was writing the description of Noelle. I was looking at a picture of Lauryn Hill. So, like if you're kind of like, sort of into that, you can read that and say, oh, is he just like fantasizing about having a relationship with Lauryn Hill here? What's going on? Or it's a genuine relationship that he has with somebody who, is helpful in his journey and his path away.
And I mean, I would
from-
argue that even if you very much decide that it was sort of mentally ill figment fabrication that he made up, even having decided that, um, the emotional reality of it is still like very vivid. And
That's the key. Like the emotional reality is real,
yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
oftentimes, I think our culture struggles with that. Like if you have an emotional reaction to something that, isn't real or didn't happen, then people will say, well, okay, that emotional reality is no longer real either. But we're human beings. Of course it's real. Of course you experience the thing. It's why they kind of the cultural I think it's one reason why the culture is like obsessed with like catfishing, for example. Like,
Mm,
it's like you fall for someone and we don't quite know what to do with that as a culture. The other thing we don't quite know what to do with as a culture is, you know, let's say really important figures, so in my case, growing up, Bill Cosby is a really important figure in my life for all kinds of reasons. And now we find out that he did horrible things and was a horrible person. What do
right.
we do with like decades of, thinking about him as the patriarch in this really fun and great family and being a great person. And also what do we do with that emotional
Right.
investment? Or Lance Armstrong, how many people like overcame cancer or died thinking, you know what, I'm fine with this journey because of what he said. I mean, like all of that stuff is still real, even if the person who inspired it turns out to be a not so good person, right? And it's
Yeah.
because we're stuck in binaries that I think the culture has a hard time like reckoning with that, reckoning with the ongoing conversation about the art versus the artist. Like we still can't because we're just so rigidly binary. You're good or you're not. It's real or it's not. And I think that kind of thinking is really inhibited us in all kinds of ways.
Yeah, and that's the intervention that metamodernism is able to kind of perform,
Yeah,
or is already performing, that we're recognizing is happening, is exploding those binaries and being able to say you can actually invest in more than one reality.
precisely. That's exactly it. And that's why it's essential because we're going to need that moving forward.
Yeah.
Because whether we like it or not, reality is fractioning. It's fracturing, excuse me, in many many ways.
Yeah.
And I don't think I think people are desperate for a way of thinking through this moment.
Mhm, mhm.
They're just it's happening. You're like it doesn't feel right. This extreme, sort of we all feel like atomized. We're all kind of by ourselves and all, and what do we how do we reckon with that? And so. Um, yeah, that's again the work that you both are doing is really important to kind of helping us process this and reckon with it, as well.
So
Would
I
you?
don't know what you both have on your plates for the rest of this discussion, but I have two topics I hope we can squeeze in before
Yeah,
we have to end. One of them is, I think, somehow we knew, Linda and I knew from rereading a transcript of another conversation you and I had or something, we knew about certified copy being
yeah.
one of your favorite films, and so we watched it both.
Oh, did you? Okay.
And I would love to hear your thoughts about that film. Um, and
Yeah.
then the other is whatever little bits you might be able to tell us about your next novel that I know is in the pipeline, if you're comfortable with that.
Absolutely.
Linda,
Yeah.
is there anything burning for you that,
Well, that was burning for me. I wanted to make sure we had time to talk about that if it's relevant, and then also if we did have time to talk about other artists that we revere.
Yeah.
Miranda July is one that I have a great deal of interest in as well. So
You said
Miranda
Miranda
July?
July? Yeah, yeah.
Miranda July, yeah. So
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Okay, certified. First of all, Abbas Kiarostami for me is just I think he's one of the greats, and I've learned so much from watching his movies and reading about him. And I think certified copy I was interested in because it engages with this long tradition of European cinema. Kiarostami is an Iranian filmmaker, and like many Iranian filmmakers, struggled to make the kinds of films he wanted to make in Iran. And I mean, even under those constraints, there's an argument for the utility of constraint for artists because, I think he made some incredible films in Iran. I mean, there's the film, the name is the title is escaping me now though, but it's the film where he's doing a documentary about somebody who stole something important from a family, and he actually goes to the court and he films it, and then um he has the people who were like the person who like apparently did the stealing and the family that was impacted by it. He has them all reenact their roles in it. So
Oh,
it's a really fascinating movie. And the guy who is supposedly commits the crime is obsessed with like movies and filmmaking.
hmm.
And he reveres a filmmaker. His surname is Makhmalbaf. And so like this character who's a filmmaker also is in the film. It's really, really fascinating. And so like watching the title will come to me soon. I should know it because I love Kiarostami's work and it'll come. But anyway, certified copy. Um, I saw it not knowing what to expect, and I think I just love one how it is resolutely itself. Like it's a story. Um, that turn that happens in the middle of the film. I'm trying to talk around it because I would love for people to see it. But there's a turn that happens in the middle where there are two realities in the film, and he doesn't privilege either one. And I absolutely love that about that movie. The question is at the beginning of the film, you have the sense that it's a kind of meet cute, so it's doing what we've discussed before. It's putting the viewer on solid ground. Like you start seeing, like, oh, I've seen this before. Like two people are, meet each other and their sparks are flying, and the woman says, let's go for a drive, like, oh, this is cool. And then there's that incredibly important scene at the cafe, where, if memory serves, they're starting to bicker a little bit, and the man leaves, and then the woman is sitting at the table, and the shopkeeper approaches the woman and says, and she refers to the person who just left as her husband. And then that becomes the reality of the film. All of a sudden, it's like they've been married for a while. And whereas it's not a meet cute, it's this guy's been absent and he's not been a good father. And she has a yearning for him and misses him, but is also angry with him. And the film doesn't say, okay, like choose one or the other. The film says both of these are true. And man, I remember leaving the theater, my mind was completely blown. I was like, wow. And it's because that rhymed with my experience of reality, like, of not having to privilege one or the other, of being able to kind of sit them side by side. I mean, it rhymed with my experience of growing up in, I described before, my the way that my parents thought about reality, and also kind of navigating this kind of home versus everywhere else thing. And then also like going to a Nigerian church for many years when I was growing up, where they talk about reality completely differently, and then having to reconcile or trying to reconcile that with, my going to school and talking with my friends and everything else. And Kiarostami was like, let's do both. Let's put them side by side. And let's not do the kind of easy thing of saying, well, no, I'm going to drop clues to say, well, this one is the actual one that you should think is real. And then reading the contemporary critical responses to it, where critics were actually trying to say, no, no, this is the real thing. The real
Yeah.
story is, like they were always married. Or the real story is that it was just a meet cute and they were playing a game at the end of the film because, somebody suggested that they were married. So they started playing a game. Like they were playing out what would happen, how they would interact with each other. And there was no one that said, no, maybe that's both are real, both happen, right?
Yeah.
So I love that about that movie.
And yet, tonally, it's very conventional.
Yes, yeah,
Like,
yeah,
And
it's
they're
not
playing
genre
with
film. It's not, it's the farthest thing from science fiction, you know.
exactly. That's what I love about it. That's what I love, because typically you see those ideas. It also said to me, like, I'm obsessed with science fiction. I really am. And I've often wondered, why am I? And I think that film, and also Tomas Transtromer's work and others, like, started to show me, like, oh, there's something in science fiction that I'm looking for, which is, like, yes, that in Star Trek they would call it technobabble. That stuff is interesting, but I'm interested in some of the more philosophical questions that sci-fi takes up as a genre that you don't really see in other genres. And I think that was the other thing about watching that film, is like, so in sci-fi you always, the multiple reality. Like I remember watching Star Trek growing up, and you'd see the other sort of alternate reality version of, some character, and you're like, wow, that's crazy. Like this person's totally different, but but stepping back, the science fiction is taking on the question of multiple realities and how that would shape us and that sort of thing. And Kiarostami, in what you described as a film that explicitly references like the long tradition of European cinema and the conventions of that cinema, but then, introduces new elements by, sort of bringing in this, what I would think of in my mind as a conventionally science fiction theme of like multiple realities. And so it's kind of disorienting because you're watching, you're like, what's going on here? Um, it reminded me of, you know, watching Solaris by Tarkovsky, which is another one of my favorite films that I also think does, Tarkovsky as an artist is also interested in porousness and membranes and passing back and forth between, spaces in Stalker and Solaris and many of his films. So for me, he was a kind of bridge to like, okay, it's sci-fi, but different kind of sci-fi. And then Kiarostami's work and the film that I was talking about was Close Up, where, he's also integrating multiple realities into a single narrative, the kind of contrived reenactment, and then the actual thing that happens, and then the response to the reenactment and the thing that happens. And it's not just a kind of game, which I think postmodernism does, like, oh, what if we do this? But it's like a story about somebody who's so obsessed with films and everything else, and is a human being who wants to be recognized and loved, right?
Yeah.
And in Certified Copy, it's about two people who are also looking for love and want to be in love and are in love at the same time, right?
Yeah, especially when the diegesis of the film is taking place in really, really ordinary places like a coffee shop and a
Yeah,
museum, and it's just present day. It's right here and now.
yeah,
It's not science fiction. And one of the other things they're able to point to, I thought, within this weird frame of not knowing which is the reality, was how many elements of performance there are in
yes,
relationships. This performance
absolutely.
layers and layers that almost you started to feel a little, I felt a little sort of effervescent, like
Yeah,
you can't really quite be on the ground, even though there's nothing, paranormal going on whatsoever.
sure.
Wow, Linda, you just made me think, and maybe this is what you were suggesting, is that in actual relationships in real life, is that almost what we all do? Is like when two people decide, we're going to be in a relationship, they're not doing something all that different from what the characters in the film were doing, right?
Yeah.
They're going along, they're just being themselves, and then they decide we're going to be partners, and now they enact
Hmm.
the archetype of people that are in love.
Yes.
Oh gosh, perfect segue to Miranda July's Me and You and Everyone We Know.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
feel like that is one of the central themes, is ordinary relationships are performed in all these ways. But
Absolutely.
again, there's that yearning for someone to understand my truly weird, quirky little way of grappling with reality. Like the main character that Miranda July plays, Christine, who's a kind of a performance artist, and then the shoe salesman, who's on one level, so the most ordinary and semi-checked out, but also still loves his kids, but kind of can't seem to manage his relationship, so he's separated from his wife. Person, they have this meeting that's so banal, but also so magical and
Yeah.
really like enchanting. There's this enchantment thing that you get to be part of, but within, again, it's like a shoe salesman in a department store. Yeah.
Yeah. She excels at that kind of thing. She really does. And, like people would describe her as like whimsical and all these words that don't quite capture, what I think she was doing, what I think she was after. And perhaps now we have the language to describe it. I remember the experience of watching that film, and that's the kind of importance of art. You're searching, you're like, what is happening inside of me? And she was one of the artists that I read her stories. First of all, I loved the fact that she was working in so many mediums, with such proficiency. I thought that was incredible. Didn't have a chance to kind of see much of her performance art, but I remember going on her website a bunch, and she was always doing some kind of project that was interesting, and the films and then the short stories. Um, so I liked her reach, but also like her willingness to kind of probe and move beyond. I mean, this is also the moment of like, was it the manic, was it pixie dream?
Yeah,
The kind of
Manic
Manic,
trope.
Pixie Dream
Yeah,
Girl.
yeah.
exactly. And so, but she kind of is playing into that a little bit, but she's also like exploding it in a way. Like she's, and I I love that kind of, you know, thing. I'm just, I'm pausing because I'm thinking of a film I just saw called My First Film, which I am obsessed with. I'm going to write about it soon. And it's, I think the name of the filmmaker is Sia Anger, I believe. But I would just, it's a film that deals with some of these similar themes. It's a film about somebody who tried to make a film and it just didn't work out. And it's that chronicle, but it's layered because, at certain points, I don't want to give it away because I think you should both watch it. Um, the film is also aware of itself in a way because the main character is based on the director. And at certain points in the film, the main character and the director will have, scenes together. And it's really interesting. So here's the director of the film who is directing a film about the time when she tried to make a film and didn't work out. It sounds like a postmodern exercise when I describe it, but it's not because it's also filled with heart and it's about and that those elements are crucial to the story. Like here she is now looking back on this moment, and this person who's playing her she has a great relationship with them. So it's about like, am I doing right by you now as I play this? It's like fascinating stuff.
Yeah.
And again, I'm unsurprised that more of these kinds of stories are emerging right now that are and there's a direct line and connection between Miranda July's work and sensibility and some of the stuff and Miranda, of course, she had All Fours last year, which a lot of people are, so she continues to be like a very astute artist in terms of describing what's going on now and how people are dealing with things. So
And she has a magical quality that I really would love to get into more conversation with whoever enjoys her. I'd love to talk more with you or
yeah,
whoever else about what
absolutely.
she achieves in her aesthetics, what they do for the viewer, because I feel like she was one of the very first people that set off the light bulb for me of this is something different.
Yeah.
This is different. It's not that it's never been done before, because I think some things that Yoko Ono has done are
Yes,
really
absolutely.
similar
Yeah.
to, but something about the way she kicks off a kind of trust in one's childlike impulses that aren't necessarily going to work out in reality, but they're going to lead somewhere, and they're going to
Yeah.
kind of make you feel a little bit freed up to go ahead and follow those impulses in a way that is it's quite special. And I don't think enough metamodern enough writing in theoretical sense vis-a-vis the lens of metamodernism has been done yet on that specific aesthetic quality, because it's
Yeah.
not just I mean, the quirky is part of what one feels like, okay, it's okay to be quirky. It's really actually, we're not alone in being weirdos and geeks or whatever and quirky. But there's something else that goes even further
Hmm.
that I think we're going to run out of time to go too far into this, but let's all stay tuned and keep talking.
Yeah.
Um,
Absolutely.
well, do we have time to just hear something about your work in progress?
Oh,
Oh yeah.
absolutely. Yeah. I think all of the stuff that we've talked about is a great prelude to, sort of my obsessions with my current book. Um, it is about 2010 in certain ways because, for me, that was a really important year, um, in terms of my development as a human, and also, the way that I began to think about art. And so the premise is, it's so interesting because I've been going back and forth with my agent about this.
Hmm.
But it starts during the pandemic, and it's auto-fictional in that during the pandemic, um, my second child was born like that first week of the pandemic. And so we were shut inside with, a then 3-year-old and a newborn. And it was just really difficult because we had been expecting, like my parents were supposed to come and her family was supposed to help, and we were just left to our own devices. And a 3-year-old was like just incredibly sad that she had been pulled out of her sort of, like pre-kindergarten, and it was just like madness. And I wasn't sleeping. Like the baby was a good baby. She was a fantastic baby, but like had all kinds of requirements. And so all of that is a setup for um, what becomes a separation from reality. That is, and he has a kind of spiritual crisis in the midst of that. And, in my first book, it's funny, like the earlier drafts had a lot more about religion and, sort of his relationship with God, and was, I guess, cut for time, to borrow a phrase from another medium. And so, but I've been thinking about those themes since then. Um, and my character becomes fixated on a moment in 2010 when he went to church, and he witnessed, and he had a spiritual experience. He was in church, and somebody like fainted, and the pastor said, here's a moment where our faith is being tested. Let's pray for this person who has fainted, and God will bring him back. And so while he's in this kind of prayer scrum with people, he has an encounter with an angel. And nobody else can see the angel. And it's not the kind of angels that we see in sort of popular media. And so, like, this is something that the 2020 version of himself has, kind of shunted aside. He had this experience, he moved on with his life, but now because he's stuck at home and he has nothing to do, and he's having, and he's exhausted, he's become fixated on this moment and what it means for him and what it means for his experience with reality. And so that becomes the kind of launching point for a series of things that happens for him. And he starts going back and forth, pinging back. And he also becomes like, he pines for the time in 2010 before he had responsibilities and he was a parent and married and bills and the rest of it. And so he becomes so fixated on this earlier period of his life. And he had this religious moment when he was open to that sort of experience, and he's no longer open to that sort of experience. So he begins to think about how, if and how he can inhabit that period. Is it possible for him to go back in time, basically? And so that sets off a series of things that happen. But yeah, that's kind of the book.
Wow.
That's a great teaser.
I can't wait to read that. That sounds amazing. I cannot wait.
Is there a title?
Now it's called a particular kind of black novel. We'll see what
No.
what the publisher does. But
I love
yeah.
that.
Is that for real?
Yeah.
Huh.
Yeah.
I'm crossing my fingers
Good,
that,
but
that's the title.
Yeah. But certainly thinking about metamodernism has been really important. I think in terms of being ambitious and unapologetic and just like really pushing things, I think, because for my first book, which I'm really happy with, but I also remember the back and forth with like the editor. My editor was fantastic, but then once the publishing started and the marketing people get their hands on it and they're like, okay, we're going to describe this as this thing or that thing, they kind of desperate push to put it in a genre that's legible and comprehensible to people. And I was just gifted with this editor who had spent much of his career working with artists like, Kathy Akker and William Burroughs and all, people who were doing all kinds of weird stuff. And he was open. And even like there's a book called Asymmetry by Lisa Halliday, I believe her name is, that came out right before my book. It was 2018 or so, that he edited as well. That's also doing really fascinating things with like, point of view shifts and everything else. And so all of which is to say that I wanted to be more ambitious in terms of thinking about, our new experience of reality and what that will mean for all of us, as we move forward. And I don't think we're quite ready for it, to be honest. I don't think we're quite ready for the dramatic ways that reality is going to shift for us. I think in many ways this decade represents, a kind of simultaneous pining for the past and a moment when things were with AI happening, and that's going to change all kinds of things in the way that we perceive things. Who knows what's happening? I maintaining interest. I guess as a sci-fi fanatic, I've outed myself, but what's happening with this UAP stuff, I don't know how much of it is real or not, but like there seems to be a dam breaking of sorts that is deeply fascinating. More people with more credentials saying that, things happened. And I'm fascinated by that as well. All of it, I think, is an indication that maybe a decade from now we'll say, wow, like, that was the last moment when
Yeah.
we were all kind of on the same, things are completely different now. And I think it'd be interesting to kind of create work that prepares us for that moment.
Well, that's interesting that I like that you're using this frame of the pandemic, because I think there's so much to mine there. Because I mean, talk about not being ready for the future. I don't think we've processed what happened to us in the direct past. I mean, talk
Absolutely.
about a
Yeah.
circumscribed reality. Like everybody created their own little
Yes.
box,
Enclosed. Yes.
contained circumscribed reality, and
Yeah.
sat in that and created that, with their little, what did we used to call our safe group or whatever, our little
Yeah.
bubble. I mean, we were so contained in so many
Sure.
directions and so many vectors.
Yeah.
And to have like this supernatural, character of this angel come permeate that is such a great. That just sounds great. I really like it. I think I'd really like to also introduce you to one of my biggest influences, which is the work of Jeffrey Kripal, who
Okay.
has done more than, I mean, I'm biased. Okay, he was my advisor in my PhD program, but he's done more than just about anybody, I think most people would say, to promote the study of the supernatural, of UAPs. I mean,
Oh, really?
he has
Linda, I'm deeply interested in this stuff, and
picked up
maybe
a
I
whole
would love
other
to talk about that.
conversation.
I've read a lot about it, and so that's yeah. What's his
Yeah,
last name?
Kripal, Kripal.
Okay.
Yeah, that's going to be a whole, get ready. Just, get some time in front of you. And once you open that Pandora's box.
I'm ready.
Well, I feel like we should probably wrap up, just in
Yeah.
terms of respecting your time. It's been fantastic to talk with you. Thank you so
Yeah.
much, Tope.
Thank you so much for having me, and I'm just it's such a privilege and an honor to speak with a couple people who have read my work and really spent time with it. It just it means so much, and I respect and admire both of the stuff that you've done as well, and I've read it a great deal. So
Thank
um
you.
I'm really happy and honored that we were able to have this conversation.
Yeah, I really
Yeah,
want
it's
to
been a
read
long time coming and worth the wait.
Yeah, absolutely. Here.
it, read it. It's a gift that keeps on giving.
Yeah, thank you so much for that.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye, folks.